All right, welcome everybody. We're in week 2, year 11, Trinity Bible Institute. We're in our first or fall trimester, and today we're going to be looking at Jeremiah chapter 2 through chapter 3, verse 5. I was attempting initially to try to tackle the whole chapter, but it just became a little bit much, and there's some really important things I want to talk about, and after to verse 5 of chapter 3. But I do think we'll be able to make gangway anyway, at any rate. So just want to just remind everybody, if you haven't done your homework reading for 2 Kings chapters 22 through 25, just want to remind you to try to get that done over this course because it's good background information. And also there's 2 Chronicles 34 through 36. It's the same, pretty much the same, but it's just worded differently. So take the time to read those chapters for a historical background. I think that'll really help us. And so, just by way of last week, remember we did your introductory material, so I just want to encourage everybody to look at your introductory material throughout the course to kind of reinforce, and maybe we'll actually learn some facts. We're talking about this whole issue of remembering things, and I'm definitely one of those people that has to have repetition. So look at your introductory material from time to time, and we'll also use the charts in the book. That'll help us learn too. And so I think if we do that and read our materials and just read the text itself too, I want to remind everybody to read through Jeremiah at least a couple of times as we go through this, and I think that'll be helpful as well. So just by way of a quick review of chapter 1 from last week, we remember that Jeremiah 1, he was introduced the prophet. We introduced him, detailing his divine calling by God and his initial hesitations as well. But we also saw the assurance of God's presence and protection as he embarks on the prophetic mission. And so we can remember, the points that we went through last week, the whole issue of the divine calling and the fact of, we discussed the whole issue of predestination and, the whole issue of Calvinistic doctrine as it relates to that. And then in verse 6, there was the fact of Jeremiah's hesitation we saw based on his doubt and lack of confidence. And not much, kind of like Moses, and we talked about that last week too. Next was God's reassurance and that he was empowered by God when we saw that God put his words in his mouth, and that was verse 9. And then we came to visions concerning the judgment of the almond branch and the boiling pot. And so the almond branch declaring God's watchfulness over his word to perform it. There was that aspect. And then the boiling pot that would be indicative of his impending disaster that was going to take place. And then lastly came the proclamation of encouragement and protection, where God encouraged Jeremiah to be courageous while giving him the warning that he will face opposition, but also gives him the confidence that God's got his back and the full protection that comes with being the man of God, that nothing can happen to him apart from God allowing it. And so that was pretty much kind of a summary of what we looked at last week along with the introductory material. And so this week we're going to look at chapter 2 for the most part and chapter 3. This section really begins with Jeremiah recording 13 oracles of divine judgment against the nation of Judah. And so that encompasses all of chapter 2 through chapter 25. Divine judgment on Judah. So there's the 13 oracles, and so today we're going to cover that oracle, the first one. And so that's what we're looking at this week. And next week we'll start the second oracle, and I'll try to get further along to kind of catch up a little bit since I intend to do 2 chapters a week. But we'll work on that, so I should be able to get through it a little quicker. But at any rate, so we have these 13 messages of judgment, which include 9 general prophecies of judgment. That would be chapter 2 through 20. And then we have 4 specific prophecies of judgment, which would be chapters 21 through 25. So the first 9 are going to be more general in nature, and then the last 4 are going to be more pointed and more precise as far as the prophecies are concerned. And so, and we'll look at that again as we go through all of this, because this really does take up quite a lot of the body of the whole book of Jeremiah. So this major section that we're looking at here. And so we have these general prophecies of judgment, the issue of chapter 1 to chapter 20, and then we're seeing, we're starting off here with the first oracle being kind of an evaluation of Judah's faithfulness, and so, or lack thereof, if you want to say that. And so before we really get started here, I just want to give kind of a summary of chapter 2 now too. Since we summarized chapter 1, this will kind of speed things along for us so we don't have to stop at every point, hopefully. But so we'll just give kind of a summary here. So God confronts Judah with their spiritual adultery. Despite God's faithfulness and deliverance from Egypt, they abandoned him for worthless idols and defiled the land that he gave them. God reminded them of their initial devotion to him, and he likened their faithfulness to a broken marriage covenant, and used the metaphor of broken cisterns to show how they chose that which was temporal over God's life-giving presence. And so this chapter serves as a call to recognize their sin, repent, and return to their covenant relationship with God before his coming judgment. And so that's kind of a summary, but those are the key themes that we're going to see in this, or key points, is this whole issue of ingratitude and apostasy would be the first one. And then we have spiritual adultery, worthless idols, broken cisterns, failure of leadership, consequences of sin, and also the issue of a call to repentance. And so those are some of the main points and themes that we're going to see tonight. And so we'll just go ahead and get on into this now. We have this whole issue of Judah's former devotion in verses 1 through 3. Jeremiah is pointing to the Lord's care for them very earlier in their history, before they were even really fully established as a nation. They were always, in God's mind, established as his people. But, when it comes to the whole issue of a nation, you have to be tied to the land that comes with it. And so there's this whole issue there. They were still a people that were set apart by God for his purposes. And so this is really a confrontation to Jerusalem of her waywardness. To give emphasis, he contrasted Judah's former devotion with her present departure. So after centuries, they were very far from God. And yes, they were even far from God in the wilderness wanderings at times. They had wandered away and their heart wasn't right. But even in the early dealings, this whole issue of sinfulness was there. But at least as a whole, they did serve and worship the one true God, which at this stage in the game they were not. And they were basically given over to their idolatry. And so, verse 1, now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, go and proclaim in the ears of Jerusalem, saying, thus says the Lord, I remember concerning you the devotion of your youth, the love of your betrothals, your following after me in the wilderness, through a land not sown. Israel was holy to the Lord, the first of his harvest. All who ate of it became guilty. Even evil came upon them, declares the Lord. And so we see this whole language here as it relates to farming and harvesting. And we kind of see this here, the whole issue of land not sown, the harvest, the first fruits, and this kind of language being used here. And also the issue of fertile land. But, I think that really, from my mind, maybe I make more out of it than I should, but I think in my mind, I think it's more than metaphorical to some sense, because in my estimation, it points to the importance of the land that is tied to the people, and the whole issue of the land covenant, too, that flows from the Abrahamic covenant as well. And so in my mind, you see this really, when you're looking at this, you kind of see this whole issue of the covenant language here. And so I think it's really kind of something to notice. But I think the main message here does point to the fact that Israel was the first to worship the true God. And it was through his covenant with Abraham, Genesis chapter 12. And this also gave assurance to his intent also to bless peoples from all nations. But we also find the issue of the judgment of calamity to those who would dare to lift up their hand against her. And so they would be guilty, and God would bring calamity upon them. And so just as those who devoured God's first fruit people, I'll just say his first fruits people, they were also guilty. They would be guilty as they dared to eat of the first fruits of the harvest, that which was set apart by God for God. It was set apart for him. And so you kind of see this whole issue here. So we have to understand this, I think, from this perspective of the Abrahamic covenant, and also from the perspective of the land covenant too as well. And I think there's really something to be said for that. And so we'll go ahead and look at, I kind of should have went over some of this, but that's all right. We'll go ahead and read this whole issue of the Abrahamic covenant here in these first 3 verses. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and all the families of the earth will be blessed. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." And so we can kind of see what I was talking about as it correlates to the text that we were looking at today. I hope that makes sense. If I'd welcome any comments, if anybody has anything in regard to that, I'd welcome any comments on that at this time. Okay, so we have Judah's present departure, and the whole issue of beginning with this issue of spiritual apostasy, verses 4 through 19. And so just to kind of go back here to this last slide, we can see how it's broken down in this chapter. We have spiritual apostasy, spiritual adultery, spiritual irresponsibility, spiritual harlotry. And you can see the correlating verses with that. And I think this is a kind of a good outline to kind of break it down for us here. And so this whole issue of their faithfulness and what that they did have, it certainly did not last in their history, obviously. They really kind of went downhill, as they progressed as a nation spiritually. They willingly forgot the Lord and that the Lord had delivered them and led them and established them as a nation. So you really can think about the magnitude of the offenses here that is laid out for us to read in this whole section. Verse 4 says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, and all the families of the house of Israel. Thus says the Lord, what injustice did your fathers find in me, that they went far from me, and walked after emptiness and became empty." And so this really is referencing the whole issue of the worthless idols and the vanity of them. "They did not say, 'Where is the Lord who brought us up out of the land of Egypt?' So they had forgotten God's deliverance, who led us through the wilderness, through the land of deserts and of pits, through the land of drought and of deep darkness, through a land that no one crossed, and where no man dwelt." And so you can see that they had forgotten God's providential care and his provision and all that God has done for them. And they failed to remember and to also be thankful for all that God had brought them through. And you can think about all the miraculous things when you think about that, and how they were fed in the desert with the manna from heaven, and how they had water provided for them in all this time, and how their sandals didn't wear out or how their clothes didn't wear out. It really is quite miraculous when you think about all of this. And they just failed to remember everything and to be thankful for what God had done for them. And so as the nation. And so moving on, to eat its fruit and its good things, but you came and defiled my land, and my inheritance you made an abomination. And so really they had defiled the land with their idolatry. And I have more to say about that. So we have to remember, too, that it's God's land, and God's people were to be stewards of the land. And that cannot be accomplished when it's treated with disdain and as if it belongs to false deities that were invented by men, by the way. And as another note, we have to know, too, that they failed to keep the law concerning the land. In that, remember that it was supposed to lay fallow 1 year out of 7? And think about all of the violations throughout their history. Well, we know that they were about to pay for that when they go into captivity. For the 70 years that they stay here, it's for every violation of not keeping that land and letting the land have its Sabbath. And so it just goes to show the seriousness of failing to keep God's laws as it relates to that. And it really is directly related to the idolatry too. And so, and really a lack of trust. It really boils down to a lack of trust in God, that they would fail to give the land her rests. And so it's really something to ponder. And this is a topic that will come up again too, so in Jeremiah. So we'll probably discuss it more at another time. But verse 8 says, the priest did not say, where is the Lord? And those who handle the law did not know me. The spiritual leaders here is what we're talking about. The priests and the teachers of the law, those who claim to represent God as mediators and spiritual leaders, they were far from him in their idolatry. The rulers also transgressed against me. That would be your kings and your governors. And the prophets prophesied by Baal. And we all know that Baal is the Canaanite fertility god. And so there's that. And they walked after things that did not profit. So in other words, you could just say they followed after worthless idols, that which had no value and just totally vanity there. And so we can notice that verse 8 is speaking of the three main branches of leadership that was established, the whole issue of prophet, priest, and king. And so those are the three main branches of government who, they didn't know the Lord, and they did set the example for the people to follow. And so this is why we always say that godly leadership is so important, because of the influence on the people. And we can also note that the result always manifests as sin against God and crimes against humanity, and also, crimes against the land. And the whole exploiting and stripping the land, or whatever the case may be. And so the fact is that really drastic measures need to be taken in order to fix the problems. And so that's really what God ends up doing when he takes them into captivity. There's drastic measures that's being taken. And so if there's ever really going to be a prosperous future for the nation. Yes, Norm?
I find it interesting that he uses the word handle instead of know. Those who handle the law instead of those who know the law.
Right. Well, yeah, that's something to think about too. So, yep, very good. So this whole issue of ungodly leadership, we really need to think about that. And so we can feel that bite even in our country today, this whole issue of godly leadership. The fact that that there needs to be drastic measures even taken in order to fix the problems, even in our society. And so maybe we're seeing some of those drastic measures come about in our time, but at any rate, it's really something to think about. So the result of paganism is really, really evident in society as a whole. And godly leadership is tantamount to the prevention of such great evil. And so I'm reminded of this verse up here, Proverbs chapter 14, verse 34. I just want to throw that up there for us. It's probably one we all got memorized. That righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. And verse 9 says, therefore I will contend with you, declares the Lord, and with your sons I will contend. And so this word contend really is a word that's used that as it relates to bringing charges or filing charges as in a court case. And so verse 10 says, for cross to the coastlands of Kittim and sea. And so Kittim here is it's Cyprus, the island to the west that is referenced. And send to Kedar and observe closely. That's the North Arabian desert tribes that are in the east. And so he's telling them to look to the north and to the east, or take a field trip, if you will, to the north and to the east and see. It's kind of like stating it like that. And see if there has been any such a thing as this. Has a nation changed gods when they are not gods? But my people have changed their glory. And when I say their glory, that means the only God with any worth or value for that which does not profit. So he's exchanging God for something that has no value, that is empty, vain, and worthless. And he goes on to say, be appalled, O heavens, at this, and shudder. Be very desolate, declares the Lord. And so this really does communicate the magnitude of the offense. And I do like what the NIV writes about this, because I think it really makes you think a little more about the seriousness of it when it says, shudder with great horror, rather than, as our translation says, shudder, be very desolate. You know, to maybe our modern way of thinking, I think to shudder with great horror would certainly have more of a force behind it. So he's telling the people here to take a trip, pointing to the west, to the east, to the Gentiles, to see for themselves that the results of idolatry would always be the same, that no pagan society has ever changed its gods, but Israel did. Okay? The idolatrous nations surrounding Judah had been more faithful to their gods than Israel had been to Yahweh. And I think that's the main point here, that the pagans are more faithful to their false deities than Israel was to the only true God. And so I think that that's really something for all of God's people to ponder when we are about to abandon God. He says, for my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, to hew out for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. So and this is another picture of the valueless, lifeless issue of worthless idols and the temporary solutions of being self-sufficient is really being compared to this useless or as broken cisterns that can hold no water. And so one of the characteristics of broken cisterns is, yes, it's going to let the water out, but at the same time, what's coming back into the cistern? Nothing but muddy, corrupted, unusable, undrinkable water. And I think that that really paints a picture, you know, as far as this whole issue of the cistern goes. And the whole issue of your own being autonomous in your own works and your own gods that are not the God of the universe, that are not of the God of the universe. So, you know, I just have to ask the question here as it relates to this. Why are people so bent on exchanging the good for the evil? That's a real human tendency of fallen, depraved man, is it not? And it really still goes on today in this whole, even in the time of Paul, in the Old Testament, time of Paul, all through the church age, it's been the same. And this whole issue of the truth exchange, we call it the truth exchange. That was a coin that Peter Jones named his ministry. They exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and they served and worshiped the creature rather than the creator, who is blessed forever and ever. And we all know what scripture reference that's from. Anyone?
Romans 1.
All right, we know something about Bible. Oh, amen. Good. I'm glad we all got that one. Okay.
The reference to Jesus at the well in Sychar with the Samaritan woman, they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters.
Yes.
And that just adds a whole nother layer of
Definitely,
administrative.
definitely. Thanks for that input there, Joan. That's good. So, moving on, 14, verse 14. Is Israel a slave or is he a homeborn servant? And so when we think about this, their whole treatment is the result, the treatment that is against them is a result of their whole sin. And it says, why has he become a prey? And this is speaking of the repercussions of their sin as being plundered by the nations, okay? You know, the whole repercussion here. How is it that the people under God's care are left at the mercy of an enemy like a slave? And so we have this whole issue. The young lions in verse 15 have roared at him. You know, that's the foreign invaders. They have roared boldly. They have made his land a waste. His cities have been destroyed without inhabitant. And so I just want to mention, I got some scriptures up here that you can kind of look at here that might be referencing what we're talking about here. And I think that there's, not maybe hard line on that, but I think that there's some historical things that happened that you can reference here as it relates to this. Just as perhaps it's a reminder of the deportation, the depredations, I should say, of Assyria, Egypt, and Babylon. And so the issue of the lion was certainly a symbol of Babylon, but it was also a figure in Assyria as well. And it had some symbolism to them too. But this reference could certainly apply to not only the Assyrians taking captive of the northern 10 tribes that took place in 722, 721, but also the Assyrian hostility to Judah, where these surrounding towns were burned and deserted, and Jerusalem was actually sieged, and as recorded in 2 Chronicles 32 and also 2 Kings chapter 18 and 19. So God did intervene at that time, we remember. He wiped out the armies of Sennacherib. Remember how many people had actually died in that when he wiped out the armies there? I think it was 185,000. 185,000 men were wiped out, and then they had to tuck tail and run back to Babylon there. They returned to Nineveh, I mean. And so, but even still, it could still be related to this disaster by the Babylonians during the 4th year of Jehoiakim's reign, as recorded in chapter 20, verse 4, 46, verse 2, and 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. And we all know that that was when Daniel was taken captive at that time, and one of the first 605, 605 BC. And then of course there were the following deportations after that, 597, 586. And so I think this is maybe referencing that first captivity. But it's one of those things that's kind of general in nature in the statement here, so it could apply to a number of those events. So just something to maybe study more, to maybe get more clarity on. But most of the commentators are not hardlined that I've read, are not hardlined on saying this is this for sure, so it's kind of one of those things that is kind of general in scope, but just be aware there. So verse 16, also the men of Memphis and Tahpanhes have shaved the crown of your head. And so what's this about here? Well, it does.
They installed Shallum as a vassal and took a lot of tribute and booty when Josiah was killed in battle.
Right. And so the cities mentioned here were Judah's allies who they had come to depend upon, right? Memphis was an ancient capital of Lower Egypt, and then Tahpanhes was a Greek, Daphne, a fortified city on the northeast border of Egypt. And so so this may reference to Pharaoh Shishak's invasion in 925. It may have application to that, 925 BC. during the time of Rehoboam, son of Solomon. And you could look at that in 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 25 through 28. And, or Pharaoh Necho's killing of Josiah, and many of the commentators actually favor this more, which took place in 609 BC, and that's recorded in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 29 and 30, which, by the way, is in our assigned reading, so if you had read that this week, you would have seen that too. And so, in both instances, though, Egypt triumphed over Judah, and the issue of this shaved crown, you know, it's also translated or rendered as fed on or grazed on. So it kind of gets back to what Joan was just talking about here. It indicates the resources of Judah were taken by Egypt, and this whole issue too of losing their covering because of the fact that they were now dependent upon the nations. And I think there's something to be said for that. But also when you consider the Egyptians and their tendency to shave their head, maybe there's something to the metaphor, that little cleverness to it to think about, because of the fact that Egyptians thought that having hair was unsanitary. So maybe there's a little something to that in the metaphor as well. And that's not something that I can be hard on, because I know the commentators make that point, but it's maybe just a thought I had. So I might be wrong on that, but it just seemed to fit, you know, with the whole issue of the Egyptians and their head shavings. And of course the Jews, if you call a Jew a bald head, remember what that's like calling them the worst thing you could call them, because they had lost their covering. And so I think that there's a lot of things that we could probably consider when you think about this whole issue here. And
Having shaved head, and historically was, the Egyptians aside, was a mark of shame. Because if you remember at the end of World War II, the French women who collaborated with the Nazis had their heads shaved.
that's a good point. That's a good point. I had forgotten about that. That is true. And so, what we find here, verse 17, have you not done this to yourself by forsaking the Lord your God when he led you in the way? But now, what are you doing on the road to Egypt? To drink the waters of the Nile? What are you doing on the road to Assyria? To drink the waters of the Euphrates? And so Judah had depended upon the alliances of Egypt and Assyria, which proved to be false alliances. And of course, you know, the superpowers of those days, they turn on you. When they get what they want, they're going to turn on you. And so instead of trusting the Lord for her stability as a nation, and that became her undoing and the source of her shame. And so they would come to realize the bitterness of drinking from the waters of foreigners rather than trusting the Lord and his provision of the living waters. Okay? And so it just really amazes me to think about. So verse 19 says, your own wickedness will correct you, and your apostasies will reprove you. Know therefore and see that it is evil and bitter for you to forsake the Lord your God. And the dread of me is not in you, declares the Lord God of hosts. And I think this really is pointing to and speaking of the repercussions of their sin as a nation. No alliances is going to protect Judah from the repercussion of her sin here. It would only be after her judgment that she would fully realize the bitter evil that comes from forsaking the Lord. And so next we move into the issue of the spiritual adultery, as our second part of our outline goes. And this section speaks to the issue of the spiritual insatiable lusting after false gods. Idolatry, as we always said and stated adamantly, that idolatry is spiritual adultery. Okay, spiritually acting like a spiritual prostitute to lust for foreign or pagan deities. And idolatry, could just certainly be self-serving as well. Verse 20 says, for long ago I broke your yoke and tore off your bonds, but you said, I will not serve. For on every high hill and under every green tree you have lain down as a harlot. And so when we think of this, we remember how they had gone and set up false centers of worship and how they put Astaroth poles and all these things to worship on every high hill and all of this. This is what God is referencing here. And he says, "Yet I planted you a choice vine, a completely faithful seed. How then have you turned yourself before me into a degenerate shoots of a foreign vine?" And so Judah is often pictured as God's vine. And this here is really picturing or showing the rebellion and the corruption from the choice, reliable stock that God had planted and nurtured to the wild, degenerate vine of foreign stock, which has its origin from foreign gods, okay, and would not produce fruit, good fruit. And so the whole issue of vines, when you think about vines, is they need to be tended, one, in order for them to grow any good fruit. You can't let them just go and keep growing out, because then the fruit does become tiny and it's not even really worth picking. But this whole issue here of grapevines is God is the one who tended the vine here, but it's not apart from the responsibility of the nation too, to be faithful, so, and we see how, the degenerate vine's going to choke out the good vine and take over, and nothing good comes of it. And so that's why we think back of John chapter 15 and the whole issue of that which is cut and destroyed, that which does not produce fruit. And that's really, we can kind of see that whole analogy there too. "Although you wash yourself with lye and use much soap, the stain of your iniquity is before me, declares the Lord." This stain cannot be washed off. And I do think it really is speaking to the outward hypocrisy here too. That there was no true change or no cleansing of heart. And it really does follow with the context here, which says in verse 23, "How can you say I'm not defiled? I have not gone after the Baals. Look at your way in the valley and know what you have done. You are a swift young camel entangling her ways." And so this really points to the willing self-deception, I would say, and the denial that anything is wrong. And so that's what happens when you start blending paganism with true godly worship. You start, convincing yourself that you're maybe actually worshiping the Lord, but you're not. And that's why sound doctrine and right knowledge is so important. But they become so used to the sin and hardened by it, and that they think there's nothing wrong. And so we find it in this whole issue of the following, and the former here with the camel, the young camel, and the wild donkey, who is accustomed to the wilderness, that sniffs the wind in her passion. In the time of her heat, who can turn her away? All who seek her will not become weary. In her mouth they will find her. And so this whole speaking here of this whole issue of the camel and the donkey who are in heat. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to handle a horse that's in heat. I have, and it can be very dangerous. It's not fun, because they got one thing on their mind, and it's not you riding them. Okay, they're not interested, and they got their mind set. And so we see this analogy here that Judah is compared to a young camel and a donkey in heat that would not be restrained in her lust for foreign gods. She's not going to be restrained, and you're not going to hold her if she wants to take off. That's just the way it is. And keep your feet from being unshod and your throat from thirst, but you said it is hopeless. No, I have loved strangers, and I will walk after them. And so we can see that analogy there as their mind set and lusting after foreign gods. So verse 26 is, the thief is ashamed when he is discovered, so the house of Israel is ashamed. They, their kings, their princes, and their priests, and their prophets, who say to thee, You are my father, and to a stone you gave me birth, for they have turned their back on me, and not their face. And so they're attributing the works of God to lifeless idols and turning their backs on God. But in the time of their trouble, they will say, Arise and save us. Can you think of the audacity here of turning back to God after such an offense? But that's the way it is with idolatrous man, is it not? We don't even seek God until we need something from him. We're going to do whatever we want. We're going to chase foreign gods. But when something bad happens or we need something, that's when we turn back to God. And so you can just really see the audacity of it in all of this. But where are your gods, which you made for yourself, God says? Where are your gods, which you made for yourself? Let them arise if they can save you in the time of your trouble. According to the number of your cities are your gods, O Judah. And so you want the lifeless false deities that are as numerous as the cities? This is really speaking to the fact that in pagan religions they had their gods localized, for whatever, gods of war, God of planting, whatever, whatever expression it may be. And so we can kind of see that as the reference here, whereas rather than holding to one true God who is omnipresent and the only God, you're going to have your localized deities, as many as there are cities. And so, moving on, we have the issue of spiritual irresponsibility, and I'll say spiritual irresponsiveness as well. You can see, kind of use those words synonymously, irresponsible, irresponsive. And we consider the audacity here of willingly denying the sin and actually putting forth charges against God as if it's his fault and not accepting responsibility for their own sin. And so, why do you contend with me? You have all transgressed against me, declares the Lord. In vain I have struck your sons. They have accepted no chastening. So they're not going to accept correction. They're not going to accept discipline. Your sword has devoured your prophets like a destroying lion. And so, in other words, there's attacking the messengers here. And so we think about the whole issue of attacking messengers, we think about what happened this week. But I'm reminded of a quote, that I think Terry sent me a quote online the other day. It was by George Orwell, and we all remember who George Orwell was, who wrote Animal Farm in 1984 and those books there that he actually published in 1949. He said, he actually is quoted saying, "The further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those who speak it." And that is certainly true, especially as it relates to Christianity. It used to be we couldn't even pick a fight, here in the past. Everybody's so liberal, you couldn't even really pick a fight. Now it's coming to the point where you can start to pick a fight now. You stand for something, stand for the gospel, stand for the truth, and then you'll start seeing people rear their gnashing teeth at you then. It's just really amazing to me. So, verse 31 says, O generation, heed the word of the Lord. I have been a wilderness to Israel, or a land of thick darkness. Have I been a wilderness to Israel, or a land of thick darkness? Why do my people say, we are free to roam? We will no longer come to you. Can a virgin forget her ornaments, or a bride her attire? Yet my people have forgotten me, days without number. How well you prepare your way to seek love. Therefore, even the wicked women, you have taught your ways. They become so bad that even the worst women could learn something from their debauchery. That's really not in a good place to be, I would say. And the people thought they were free and independent, and they forgot all of God's past dealings and blessings with them. Verse 34 says, also on your skirts is found the lifeblood of the innocent poor. You did not find them breaking in. But in spite all these things, you said, I am innocent. Surely his anger is turned away from me. Behold, I will enter into judgment with you, because you say, I have not sinned. Why do you go around so much changing your way? Also, you will be put to shame by Egypt, as you were put to shame in Assyria. From this place you will go out with your hands on your head, for the Lord has rejected those in whom you trust, and you will not prosper in them. And so when turning one's back on God in favor of false deities, and false alliances, and the nations, and immorality, and a lack of common decency really becomes evident in crimes against God, humanity, and the land, as I'd stated before. Loveless and self-serving becomes the norm, and God is abandoned. And so this is really something to take warning about here. So, moving on to chapter 3. And so we have this issue of spiritual harlotry here in verses 1 through 5. And we're just going to read through this and I got to get through this really quickly here to keep my time. So God says, if a husband divorces his wife and she goes from him and belongs to another man, will he still return to her? Will not the land be completely polluted? But you are a harlot with many lovers. Yet you turn to me, declares the Lord. Lift up your eyes to the bare heights and see, where have you not been violated? By the roads you have sat for them like an Arab in the desert. And you have polluted a land with your harlotry and with your wickedness. Therefore the showers have been withheld. That's talking of the latter and the early rains, by the way, the latter rains and the early rains. Therefore the showers have been withheld, and there have been no spring rain, yet you had a harlot's forehead, and you refused to be ashamed. Have you not just called on me, my father? You are the friend of my youth. Will he be angry forever? Will he be indignant to the end? Behold, you have spoken and have done evil things, and you have had your way. And so in our last slide here, we can kind of see this whole issue of Deuteronomy chapter 24, in the first 4 verses, and the issue of the law of divorce. And so this relates to the law concerning divorce. If a man divorces, such a man is not to take that woman as his wife again, because this would defile her, and it would certainly be a scandalous thing. And so Jeremiah uses this analogy to picture Israel as a harlot in the spiritual realm, with her lovers being the gods of the nations. And yet God would graciously end up receiving Israel and Judah back as his own wife if she would just repent. And so we can see the mercy of God in all of this. And it's just amazing to me. And so using this analogy of such scandalous behavior to illustrate the seriousness of idolatry, and at the same time he's showing God's graciousness and faithfulness even when men are so unfaithful and putting other gods before him. And so if you all had the chance to read that, I'm not going to read it out loud. That brings me to the end of this class tonight. And so got to remember this is a survey, so I had to resist the temptation to comment on every verse. I wanted to so bad, but I don't have time for it if I'm going to get through this. I remember when I was going through the Psalms, I had the same problem. I ended up having to save a couple of Psalms for a sermon because I just couldn't get through it because I had too much. My mind is why I wanted to just, say everything. But you can't really do that in this setting. But I'd welcome any quick comments before we close class here. We're at time. All right. Thank you, class.
We have a sermon coming up.
Yep, we got a sermon coming up this week. Yep.